Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to skip introducing my panel members, as you should know, or you all know, or should know who they are, because I would like to maximize the 75 minutes we have for this session. As mentioned, our topic is corporate conduct, the role of regulation in changing behavior. We will obviously talk about shell manufacturing, backdoor listing, and warehousing, so that you get your money's worth. But I also want to discuss whether the problems we see in our market today are problems of the rules, or the problems of the administration of the rules, or problems of the enforcement of the rules, or they're actually not problems at all. I hope I will have time to ask my panel exactly what sort of market we want to see in Hong Kong. And of course, time for Q&As. I've told my panel members that I want a lively and no-hold-barred discussion. And that's why you can see that I'm sitting in the middle, so that I can try and make sure that every panel member has equal amount of time to speak. So apologies in advance if we all have to be very direct, myself included. Now let's start. To set the scene, Brian has prepared a couple of slides, and I promise these will be the only slides in our session today, which he would like to share with us. And I do think it's a good way to get us all up to speed as to what is happening in our market today as compared to, say, 10 years ago. If only from the viewpoint of our statutory securities regulator. Now, I have not independently verified any of the information in the slides, but they are coming from the SFC. So, Brian, over to you.
Thank you, Teresa. Let's start, and I will try to be fast in going through all the slides. Firstly, I think David and I actually have been working very hard in the past few years on a number of things, and we believe actually we made us quite a lot of change in behavior after our work. So examples include our GEM review, which has concluded, the highly dilutive rights issue review actually will be concluded soon. And also, we have issued a statement concerning overvalue transaction. In terms of we jointly observing market behavior, thus considering policy review, one of the most difficult issues actually is about backdoor listing and shell activities. And there are more difficult questions such as warehousing of shares and independent voting and things like that. Now, let's quickly look at the market in 10 years, a quick comparison. Market cap, 64% increase. Of course, others say, oh, you haven't taken into consideration inflation, but let's forget that. Number, 71% increase. In the fine print, we notice that there are more small companies and also GEM companies in recent years. Now, interestingly, when we compare 2007 and 2017, we see the decreasing trend of earning by reviewing prospectus. 10 years ago was just 10%, whilst 2017 last year was 45%. So when I was back in the market a long time ago, I thought it is always crucial for issuers and even the sponsors to ensure that it is more kind of rising trend in terms of revenue and profit in order to get a better valuation and pricing. And on that, I would like to invite all of you and investors to sort of help me on that. But it looks like that now that is not quite the trend. Next is that we switch a bit to sectorial distribution about companies. The first slide at the top is a quick comparison. And then you, on the right-hand side, you quickly see emerge, very interestingly, 10 years ago was one construction company, and last year was 38. And At the bottom, we'll see that between 2013 and 2016, there were 61 construction companies listed. And more interestingly, up to 2017, 30% of them actually changed hands. And I don't want to jump to conclusion about what message we pick up from this, but perhaps investors such as Manuel or David can help me. Is it really sort of, there is a kind of big market for construction company IPO? We have 10 major infrastructure projects. It may be a very sort of...
It's Belton Road, isn't it?
Oh, okay, yeah. So let's look at some sort of case study or observed behavior. Then, actually, there are quite a number of cases with similar facts. There was a company A, construction company in 2014, controlling shareholder, Mr. A, and then, very quickly, within a year, through various means, he disposed of almost like all his shares, and some through pledges and some through other means. And in 2016, then the company gradually, through different transactions, basically acquired a lot of other kind of business, bigger size, but different nature. It's a sort of environmental protection businesses. And finally, they attempted to basically dispose of the remaining construction business back to Mr. A. But I think the exchange quite rightly ruled that, sorry, this is a deemed new listing. However, the company then, okay, I don't do the last bit, stopped. So that was that. But what message do we pick up from this? It's the third slide, all the sort of new business, basically they're getting around new listing requirements. These haven't gone through sponsors' due diligence, and there is no transparency other than sort of transaction rules in the listing rules gatekeeping them. Now, very quickly, I don't want to go into the background of front-loaded regulation. Ashley's talked about, Carlson has talked about them. Just very quickly, this slide shows we step up on front-loaded. And then we saw some behavior change, including GEM. I think I've shown this slide a couple of times, that interestingly, in previous year, the day one GEM IPO price was like 3 times, 7 times, 8 times, but now, since January 2017, it was 23%. Now, the last case, Company B, there is no urgent funding need. It did 2 highly dilutive rights issues. And then basically what happened is some shareholders purportedly, they was independent and they went voting, they acquired some shares from the chairman. And then interestingly, after voting for the transaction, they didn't subscribe to the right shares. They dumped the shares, suffering losses. We conducted investigations, and we believe we have evidence, and we exercise our front-loaded approach, SMR, and suspend the stock. That's the last slide. Back to the first slide. There are many things, many behavior that under the observation of me and David, there's a lot of work for us to work on. However, I have to say, I would like to single out warehousing of shares, which by itself is not an offense. We actually, through lots of investigation, a lot of people are paid a few $1,000s, that their monthly income may be $10,000, $20,000, but they're holding tens of millions of shares, dollars worth of shares. And this phenomenon, based on Hong Kong, where listing rules using a lot of voting to gatekeep transactions and gatekeep other disciplines, is very worrying. I don't have a full solution at the moment, and all views are welcome. And finally, I want to reconnect panel 1, a comment about the risks of biotech companies, where actually, I'm not too worried about the commercial risks of these companies. I'm more worried about that if we don't administer the regime good enough, then I think biotech companies, pre-revenue, can be a good source of providing shares. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. David. I saw you trying to take your glasses out. So do you have any response to the set of slides? I mean, you don't have to. They are what they are, and we can go straight into the substantive discussions, but I just want to put it to you whether you want to say something.
Of course I want to say something. That's why I'm on the panel. And actually, you've invited us to be very direct and provocative. So why don't I start by being very direct and provocative? I think obviously the panel is focused on issues that we see in the market, but from my point of view, I think we have to put them in context. I mean, I think undoubtedly we have some of these problems in our market, but I think they affect a small number of companies and a small number of abusers. And I think we have to, from my perspective, I think we have a high quality market which is very well regulated. We need to deal with these issues, and they have a disproportionate effect on our reputation, but I do think they affect a small number of companies. And I think between SFC and ourselves, over the last several years, we have tried very hard to deal with these issues. They are very difficult. There's no panacea for some of these problems. I welcome the SFC's front-loaded approach. I think it is important that they're on the field with us in relation to some of these issues, because they are difficult issues for us to tackle alone. But I also think that over-regulation is just as dangerous as under-regulation in some of these areas, and that if we are not careful, we will go down a route where we have so much regulation in Hong Kong that a lot of legitimate business activity is not able to take place, and that will ultimately affect our competitive positioning. And I think we have to bear that in mind between ourselves and the SFC as we regulate. I just want to pick up on a couple of Brian's slides, because Brian has said, let's not draw any conclusions necessarily from those slides, but they carry an implication, I think, around we have been possibly listing some poor quality companies over the last several years. We've been listing some companies which are then potential shell companies going forward. So I think one of Brian's slides suggested that we've listed more companies in recent times which have decreasing earnings in their last year. I think you have to look a little bit at the underlying data in relation to that. We have over the last couple of years listed a lot more gem companies. And the reality is, and we'll come on to this when we look at the suitability guidance letters, these companies have significant, vis-a-vis their earnings, they have significant listing expenses, and it does have an effect on the last year of the earnings of these companies. So that's one point I'd make in relation to that. In relation to the construction sector, I saw that it got us a bit of a laugh that we've listed all these construction companies. It represents, in fairness, it represents a reasonable percentage. On the main board, the 61 IPOs that Brian portrayed on the slide represent 11% of the companies that we've listed. So it is a meaningful proportion, but it only represents 0.04% of the market capitalization of Hong Kong. So it's a very small number. And then if you look at the 30% which have changed hands in terms of controlling shareholder, on its face, that suggests they've been the subject of backdoor listings. But in reality, when you go into the analysis, that's 17 companies we're talking about. On 7 of those cases, there was a general offer made under the takeover code for those offers. And so if they were genuinely, and I'm not saying they weren't, shell companies for whom the value is 600 or 700 million Hong Kong dollars, then that value needs to have been transferred somewhere underhand in breach of the takeovers code to achieve that. Because it would obviously be a special deal. In 9 cases of those 17, although another shareholder became the largest shareholder in those companies, in a number of those cases, they did it through market purchases in which the previous shareholder participated, but they came often through market purchases rather than a single block sale from the single largest shareholder before the transfer. So it's not a story which is quite as stark as maybe that slide suggests. And on 3 of the cases in relation to construction companies, we have stopped them and made them RTOs. So I think, to just put a little bit in perspective, I think there is a little bit more story behind that. And I think we have to be careful as we go through this and focus on the problems that we put them a bit in perspective.
Okay, well, thank you, David, for that explanation, which is, I think, in the context of some specific cases. But we want to go broader, because my take from Brian's slides are that backdoor listing, shell manufacturing, and warehousing are all interrelated, and it is quite clear that this activity is going on. And I thought that the listing rules have already attempted to fix it, in that nowadays backdoor listing or deemed backdoor listings are expected to go through the same vigorous listing approval process as an IPO. So why does backdoor listing still happen? And so I'm going to ask each of the panel members why the latest listing rules doesn't work or hasn't worked for our market. And I'm going to turn to David Webb first. And David, I know that you've been following this for a very long time. What, in your view, started this trend of backdoor listing, and why haven't we been able to discourage these RTOs? And you know there's a lot of money involved, and the market value is rumored to be something like 600 on 700 million for a clean shell.
Well, backdoor listings are a phenomenon that have been around at least as long as the stock market has, in probably even earlier. 1986 was when the unified exchange began, but early red chip listings, for example, the steel company, Shellgang Steel, and CITIC Pacific in about 1992 was a backdoor listing. More recent big backdoor listings might include Hanergy, for example, which was, a seriously large company before it was suspended. And so the reason is simple market forces. There's a certain amount of scrutiny and sponsorship that needs to go on with a front door listing. You then have a lock-up period and disclosure obligations if you pledge your shares, which you don't have after the first year. So there's a more rigorous process for the front door, whereas with the back door, what happened 14 years ago was a change in the rules trying to counter it, but was completely ineffective and actually counterproductive. The rules changed to say that a very substantial acquisition would be treated as a new listing if it resulted in a change of control, or any series of acquisitions amounting to the same thing. And what happened then, of course, was that financial engineers looked at that and said, okay, we can work around that. We'll have 29.9% issued to the incoming controller. The old controller will leave, and the new controller will also hold convertible bonds that would take him well over the majority level if he ever converted them. And he will not do that as long as it doesn't trigger, as long as it would trigger a general offer, he won't convert. But effectively, he controls the company. And he does that, obtaining a ready listed company, only having to produce an accountant's report and get shareholders' approval, often from the exiting controlling shareholder. And no lockups, no real sponsorship scrutiny over the incoming business. So if you are engaging in potentially fraudulent practices, or your mainland injection would not withstand scrutiny, in terms of the some of the work that would be needed in due diligence, then you go through the back door. And that's why there's a substantial premium paid to get to the market. Also speed as well. There is a process that is faster somewhat with some VSAs than there is going through the front door. So that's part of it. But investors, particularly in the smaller end of the market where I am, I hold more than 5% of 19 listed companies now, and occasionally, for perfectly honest and economic reasons, their business fails or goes into a sunset mode, and the listing is all that they have left and becomes an asset that shareholders can at least get something from when it's converted into a new business with new owners. I have no objection to that in principle, but I do object if the company has liquidated its existing business and failed to distribute the proceeds to shareholders, to give them an exit rather than being dragged along. Because as a minority shareholder in a controlled company, you are in the back seat of a car, and it's not very nice if an incompetent driver gets into the front seat and the good driver gets out. At that point, you want to be able to open the door and get out yourself. And what we need then is a better capital discipline. The slide that mentioned the so-called front-loaded enforcement was actually involved a suspension according to the slide, of a company that had already done 2 very highly dilutive rights issues. And I think I know that it was a case that is in progress, obviously, because it's still suspended, but it took 2 years before the stock was suspended, by which time shareholders' value was diluted 90%. And what we actually need is a general rule that doesn't require the SFC to intervene, but says, if you are going to engage in a transaction and liquidate your assets, it must be conditional on independent shareholders' approval of a distribution that will bring your balance sheet down to a much smaller level of liquidity, not more than 50% net cash against your net assets remaining. If we had that discipline, and companies were not allowed to engage in a transaction that would violate that, either by doing a massive rights issue or a placement, which wasn't even covered, placements weren't covered in the recent consultation, or simply by hoarding profits and never distributing them. If you had to go to shareholders for independent shareholder approval to get into that situation, then there would be that discipline, and we could happily then look at companies selling their main business, shrinking themselves down, distributing the proceeds, finding a new owner and injecting a new business. But in order to avoid this backdoor, front door problem, I think of it in terms of a nightclub. The more bouncers you put on the front door, if you leave the back door open, people will happily go around the back. So if you impose profit criteria and artificial barriers to the front door, they'll go around the back and pay for that. So we need to tighten the back door somewhat at the same time as rethinking the front door. And I would do this. On the front door, I would abolish the profit criterion. I would abolish the revenue criterion. Since we're doing that for biotech anyway, why limit it to biotech? Why not people who are designing new artificial intelligence chipsets, or some product that requires years of expenditure before you can sell a single chip? Let's just have 3 years of clean audited reports and let the investors decide. So that's the front door. I'd also abolish the requirement for a public offer tranche, because that's expensive and unnecessary for some companies. On the back door, I would say, look, this 2004 rule change was clearly counterproductive. Let's just say that any very substantial acquisition should be treated as a new listing application, and we want a full description of the business to a prospectus standard, and we'll basically even out the front door, back door problem and make it a fairer market.
Okay, David, thank you very much. I mean, my take from what you've said, and you've spent quite a bit of time explaining it all, is that the rules are ineffective, the administrations of the rules are not effective, and then the enforcement also needs looking into. Now, I'm going to ask Manuel. Manuel, you invest in small and mid caps. What are your views on backdoor listings? Are they really bad for the market? And if so, have you any suggestions? Do you agree with some of the proposals that's been advocated by David? In other words, for example, that doing any very substantial transaction, you need basically a full listing document in order to provide information and for the shareholders' vote.
I think there are really two different perspectives to look at this. I think from a purely investment perspective, a backdoor listing can be positive because it can lead to a re-rating in the shares. It can be a catalyst for re-rating. Typically, when you have a shell deal, there are two effects on the valuation of the company. One is a potential benefit for all of the shareholders that they can share in their portion of the shell premium. And especially if you look at some of the smaller cap companies, I mean, a lot of companies that I invest in are maybe 1 or 2 billion Hong Kong dollar in market cap. So if you have a shell premium of, say, 5 to 700 million Hong Kong dollar, that becomes very significant. So it can be a positive for shareholders to benefit from that. The other effect on the valuation is that very often the existing assets within the company, they are being re-rated as part of the transaction. Because often, I mean, as we've seen in one of the slides from Brian, very often as part of a shell deal, the assets are being privatized or sold to another company. So, if you look at the small cap investment space in Hong Kong, a lot of the companies trade at a big discount to the tangible book value. So if they see a re-rating, all of the shareholders can benefit in an uplift in valuation. So the honest answer is that as an investor in small cap companies, I'm generally supportive if there's a change of control that could lead to a backdoor listing, because it can be very profitable for the existing shareholders. That, of course, is under the assumption that all of the shareholders benefit equally as part of the transaction, which is not always the case.
That the premium is shared amongst all the shareholders.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a mindset sometimes with the controlling shareholders that they think because they control the company that they should be getting all of the shell premium, rather than it being shared equally across all of the shareholders. Now, looking at it from an overall market perspective, I do have to say I have some reservations whether it's good for overall corporate governance. There's nothing wrong with a backdoor listing if the assets that are being injected qualify under the listing rules and come with a clean track record. But I think the past has shown that backdoor listings do attract some questionable characters. Maybe because they want to avoid the extra scrutiny around a front door listing. So, those are not the people we want to attract to the market in Hong Kong. So I think it really emphasizes the importance of ongoing regulation and minority shareholder protection.
Okay, thank you, Manuel. To my mind, shell manufacturing, which is a related issue to backdoor listing, is a supply and demand issue. And just looking at the stats that we were just presented, 61 IPOs in the same construction industry, and it's not counting the 38 that were listed in 2017. So if you add the two together, we're talking about 100. Sounds to me to be quite a lot of potential supply of shells. And so before I go further, do I have the nod from all my panel members that shell manufacturing is not something we want to pin our reputation on as an international financial center? Nod.
Sure, yes, I'll nod. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Good, okay. Yep. Now, I know that the stock exchange has tried to reduce shell manufacturing in the Hong Kong market. In fact, they did this in 2016. In fact, they issued a guidance letter identifying some shell characteristics which may bring suitability for listing into question. Things like, very small cap, and then, a large amount of the proceeds are used for listing expenses as opposed to for the company, and no external funding pre-listing. But we have seen that more than a year on, shell manufacturing activities have carried on unabated. So, David, yes, no laughing matter. Why has it been so hard to reduce shell manufacturing at the supplier end? Is it a division issue? Is it a listing committee issue? Is it the rule issue? What is it? Is it not strong enough guidance?
I think it's an SFC issue, actually.
Is it an SFC issue? Okay, now,
I don't.
Brian, no, that's enough. Brian, in the era of real-time front-loaded regulation and using your powers, as Carlson has explained, under the SMLR, please explain, you've explained it, so others have explained, so you don't need to explain it. Are we likely to see fewer shells being manufactured from now onwards?
I agree with David that we should tackle the problem.
Which David?
David Webb. We should tackle the problem in the backdoor listing rules and also the administration. Can I go back a little bit of history? Now, essentially, three typical features of backdoor listing is that there is change of control or de facto control or something like that. There is acquisition of assets, new assets, can be split into, I've seen cases with 36, 38 transactions. And then there's disposal of original business back to somebody. Three elements. Now, the trick is that other than splitting the injection into so many transactions and then throughout a period of time, the difficulty is that they play around with these three elements in different times. So meaning sometimes you see a case that injection is before change of control. Sometimes you see the other way around. And it's very difficult to have rules, even principle-based, to catch sort of such scenario.
But
Can I finish? Then, interestingly, I think I alerted you. Yesterday I read Hay Davidson report again.
Hay Davidson's report was dated
1987, 1988. The same point was picked up.
right.
And sorry. Then, interestingly, the listing rules were most effective after Hay Davidson in the 90s. Basically, it's, again, David's point, that every VSA actually, we presume it to be like a deemed new listing. However, unless you can convince us that it is not a backdoor listing. So it's the other way around. But I think the whole issue is about one side say we want certainty and genuine transactions. The other side is we don't want circumvention of listing rule requirements. It's a kind of debate of both. So the pendulum has been swung from one end. So after 2003, I think the market preferred that let's have more certainty, more bright line. Let's go less principle-based, and then develop into until the 2014 guidance letter. And then here comes the debate.
Right.
Actually, maybe before you go, maybe I just want to, before I let
But
Brian talk about...
but I think that this might actually put what you're going to say in context. I just want to say that the current rules give you power to take account of series of transactions or arrangements already.
For sure.
So surely it can't be too hard for you to say, I'm sorry, or you don't even have to say I'm sorry, but I deem you to be a new application for listing. So why is it so hard?
I want to deal with 2 points, actually. The first point, before I gave the very flippant answer that I blamed the SFC for the shell maintenance, for the shell creation. We did put forward that guidance letter that you referred to. I think, actually, contrary to what you said, I think it has had an effect on the creation of shells. We know anecdotally there are quite a number of sponsors who have turned down the type of companies that they otherwise would have brought forward.
So it could be
83
as opposed to 38 last year.
Could it be?
Well,
Right,
it's probably because
okay.
the inventory
No,
is
but
full.
it has had it. But the problem is, in all honesty, when you look at the Shell Guidance Letter, the difficulty is you are trying to work out what the intention is of people going forward, and it is very hard to do. Those factors that we've listed, we could make a bright line test. We could come out with a rule which says that if your listing expenses are 70% of your issue proceeds, you can't list. We could theoretically take some industries and say we're not going to list you because you are asset light and therefore potentially you're going to be a shell. But that goes back to the point I made a bit earlier. I think over-regulation is as dangerous as under-regulation. So and then moving on to what Brian has just discussed, the RTO rules, the backdoor listing rules, were written with a view to a very classic backdoor listing structure whereby you bought control and you injected the assets that you had into that business. I think that has largely stopped. You do not get that simple transaction anymore. What Brian is talking about is absolutely right. The example he gave, people are now splitting up the transactions. They are doing it through subscriptions. They're doing it through asset injections and disposals over a period of time. And to be fair to both us and the SFC, we have been using one of our other powers to actually stop them doing that. So we have seen some successful applications, and we are going through a process with SFC whereby we will enhance our rules in this respect. The final point I want to make, the idea that we turn every VSA into a new listing and we require sponsor due diligence, again, we can do it. But it will have a chilling effect on legitimate corporate transactions by quite a number of companies. If you are in an auction situation and you want to do that, and we have a requirement to go through all that process, the Hong Kong listed company which is bidding in what might be an international auction is going to be at a competitive disadvantage. So while I don't disagree...
Well, then they should be bigger. We're talking about 100% of gross assets as a threshold, right? It's a huge transaction relative to the issuer. So it's quite a rare situation. No property company would blow all their balance sheet on one asset.
But again, I think it's a case of where you draw the balance between how you regulate and over-regulation versus under-regulation.
Okay, now let's turn to another topic, which is corporate abuses that we have seen. I think a few had been mentioned: dilutive rights issues, excessive use of the general mandate to dilute or to just bring in friendly shareholders, hoarding cash, David Webb has mentioned that, appointing friends who won't rock the boat as independent directors rather than to represent interests of all shareholders, including the minority shareholders, are just a few of the obvious ones. Manuel, I want to ask you, do you see these as governance issues, or do you think it's the regulation that we have that has been driving the wrong kind of behavior? If you think it's the regulation, and we talked about a lot of regulations would not be effective today, maybe you can give us one or two examples.
Yeah, I certainly do think that regulation plays a very important part to shape corporate governance, and I also do think that there are several items of regulation that can be enhanced. I mean, from my perspective as a minority shareholder, the dilemma that I face is what David described earlier. Ultimately, I completely am at the mercy of whoever is in charge, whoever controls the company. So that really puts two aspects at the top of my agenda. I mean, for me, preemptive rights are very important, as well as efficient capital allocation and capital management.
20% mandate, 20% discount maximum. Is that
That's
too much?
right. Yeah, so I think, I mean, in general, we've got an issue with placements and highly dilutive rights issues, and there's a consultation paper out currently, I think, that goes in the right direction in a lot of those aspects. But it's not just a concern from a kind of economic dilution perspective. The other problem is that it often places shares in friendly hands, which then leads to other issues and sometimes even outright fraud. So to pick one particular example, if we talk about the general mandate, we are still at 20%, at a 20% discount. I believe many years ago there was a consultation paper on that, but for some reason that hasn't been addressed. So I personally haven't spoken to any other shareholder who thinks that is a good idea. I mean, the UK has much stricter
5%,
regulation.
5% discount.
Yeah, they're at 5%, that's right.
Yeah, and there's no evidence that that's restricted the economic capacity of UK companies. It's something that was fought out and resolved in 1987 with the publication of the preemption guidelines, and it's worked ever since. And two of our biggest companies, HSBC and Standard Chartered, which are primarily listed in the UK, comply with that. And several others have done so voluntarily because they know that shareholders find it important enough to vote against the general mandate when they see the 20% mandate. If you look at the voting figures since poll voting was introduced, you can see that the non-controlling shareholders, the outsiders, are voting more than 2 to 1 against the general mandate. So it's high time that we looked at that again and said, look, it's up to shareholders to choose directors and not the other way around, which is what the general mandate does, and in extreme cases has been used to warehouse votes, effectively, to place votes in friendly hands before doing something very bad.
Right. So David, on sort of preventing corporate abuses or getting more out of directors, I know that you are a very strong proponent of having independent directors voted in by independent shareholders only. So, we've heard you plenty, but I can see the clear logic on that. So I'm going to give you 2 more minutes to put your case on that one.
I'll have 2 minutes, not 2 more. The independent, look, it's quite simple. Do you believe in a one-party state in the boardroom, or do you believe in proportional representation with minorities having a fair representation in the boardroom? Because at the moment, the controlling shareholder votes on the election of the candidates that they've put forward. Now, even if the minorities were to all vote against those candidates and nominate their own, they'd be voted down by the controlling shareholder. And that makes a mockery of the term independent. You can't be independent of the people who determine your election. These same people then have to opine on connected transactions with the controlling shareholder, on privatization offers by the controlling shareholder, and you expect them to be independent. And if they do start to act too independently and ask difficult questions, they'll be taken out to lunch by the chairman and controlling shareholder and asked not to stand for re-election. So we should be honest about this and say, look, we're either going to stop pretending that we have independent directors and giving investors false comfort in the idea that someone's watching out for them, or we're going to have a proper system which says that at least for these 3 people, 1/3 of the board, that they can be proposed by whoever the board, the controlling shareholder, whoever, but they've got to be acceptable on a vote to the independent shareholders. And I think if we did that, those people would feel, A, that they had to be free of conflicts and they actually had a mandate to ask those questions, that they can't be taken out to lunch and removed, and they would have to report back, I think, on a 1-page in each annual report, whether or not they're satisfied with the governance of the company, and if not, why not? Because then when it subsequently implodes, if they had said they were satisfied, you could at least look to them and say, why did you say that? So, you know, the UK has made a small step in this direction by saying that independent directors must be approved by 2 things, a majority of all shareholders and a majority of the independent shareholders. That's something at least. We haven't even gone to that small step forward in Hong Kong. And I wrote about a network last year that had 50 companies with 150 independent directors, and it still was allowed to set up in that situation. So, you know,
okay, well, why don't we ask our regulators? David, I know we've just done a little mini review of the corporate governance code. So what do you think of David Webb's proposal? But I do want to say at the outset that we do pile on a lot of responsibilities, potential liabilities, and risk management on the shoulders of our poor independent directors. And I've often said that our regime is using them to enforce a lot of our rules. So, you know, if we are going to get into a place where they are appointed only by the minorities, would it lead to a better outcome? And in any event, you know, is this something that we are likely to see being put before the listing committee for consideration?
So look, this is David's obviously talked a lot about this over the years. It's a subject that actually, I think on the corporate governance side, we have looked at on a number of occasions over the last 15 years. So when it was last consulted on, which is about 15 years ago, this particular proposition, it didn't get the support of the market to do it. When we went out in 2010, this wasn't part of the proposition, to be honest, and the only person who really raised it was David. But
sorry, there's never been a proposal. There's never been a proposal to have a vote on this.
That was 8 years ago. A lot has moved on.
And now, when we looked at it, we've obviously just put out a consultation in relation to corporate governance. So we debated this long and hard at the listing committee. We did a lot of soft consultation before we put out the corporate governance consultation paper back towards the end of last year. And again, at that time, there wasn't a lot of support for this proposition. And I suppose, just to put the counter to David's arguments, you know, firstly, we obviously do have independence requirements in the listing rules. These directors are meant to be independent by the criteria that we've set out. I realize there may be practical issues around that. Secondly, as a matter of law, obviously the independent non-executive directors owe their duty to all the shareholders. They don't just owe it to the controlling shareholder or to the minority shareholder. And the third point is, I appreciate the point that the way it's constructed at the moment is the controlling shareholder clearly has the overwhelming say as to who's appointed. If you flip it the other way around, you put that in the hands of potentially a very small number of minority shareholders because of the way the voting structure works in Hong Kong. So you could end up with a situation where somebody who holds a relatively small number of shares in the company is really responsible for appointing the non-executive directors and for driving an agenda which is against the broader interests of the company and causes a huge friction between the executive directors and the non-executive directors. So I'm not dismissing the point. It has been debated. We have thought about it. If I'm honest,
sorry, there's never been a proposal from the listing committee to do that. It's not been debated. Right. I wasn't in the soft consultation, and I don't know any investor who was, David.
Let's agree to differ.
So let's just get the facts right. You're entitled to your own opinions, but not facts. Okay. Right, there hasn't been a consultation yet on that yet.
Okay. Yes. Now let me turn to. Thank you, David. Let me turn to Brian. I think we are talking about the role of regulation in changing behavior. Now, and we all heard that we don't want to over-regulate. This proposal another situation where regulation may drive the wrong behavior? In other words, if we have what David has proposed, that independent directors are going to be appointed by independent shareholders, do you see even more warehousing of shares where controlling shareholders scramble to have lunch with everybody, who are independent directors to make sure that the vote is cast in the right way so that they can still get, their friends onto the board?
My view is if there is a policy or we seek to improve the policy on INEDs, etc., it's always a good thing. However, in my view, if the purpose is about changing behavior or using more sort of a deterrent regulation to change behavior, in my view, that proposal is not the most effective. For example, comparatively speaking, I would say the whistleblower policy will be a far more effective policy. And also in implementing, it's far less controversial than anything touching on a policy where it sort of affects every single listed company. Not to say that I disagree with David. I'm actually in agreement with David, but I think it's a matter of David Webb.
Right.
You
agree with him a lot.
It's only because I'm right.
David, what are you going to say?
No, sorry, Teresa. I'm actually in disagree with him that this should not be a top priority. I think there are certainly other more effective proposals.
All right.
So on that front, I disagree with him.
Okay, now let's turn to another topic. Okay, let's
not the only good thing we could do.
Another tool to drive the right kind of behavior. Now, we all see that every time when you put out a sort of a win on the enforcement side, there might be, at the listed company front, one of the perceived remedies to cure the lack of governance is directors' training. Right. Now, under the Corporate Governance Code, directors' training is still not compulsory. It is directors should but not must participate in continuous professional development to develop and refresh their skills and knowledge. So do directors' training really work? And if not, how can it be made to work? And I do want to ask Manuel, because when you pick stocks, I'm sure that you look at the skills, knowledge, and experience of the management team. And how much can director training really help to enhance corporate governance?
Yes, that's right. I mean, when I evaluate a potential investment opportunity, I spend a lot of time on evaluating the management team and the board. And the three areas that I primarily focus on is one, how the management team runs the ongoing operations of the company, so the day-to-day business. Two, how they allocate the capital and how they think about capital management. And then three, whether there's any signs of outright fraudulent activity and how they have treated minority shareholders in the past. So these are I would say, three main categories. With regards to your question on directors' training, I think it can be very positive, especially around the area of capital allocation and capital management, because that's something that I've found is often misunderstood by the management teams and the board of directors. The whole concept around opportunity cost of capital, seems to be misunderstood. So I would focus on that segment. And in fact, David has proposed in the past a cash shell test, which I think would address some of the most extreme cases around inefficient balance sheet management and bloated balance sheet. So that's something I think would be very positive. With regards to the other areas, the ongoing management, I think typically the management team, they do a decent job. I don't think the directors' training would be able to help much with that. And to be honest, around the fraud risk aspect, I don't think in reality there would be much impact from directors' training, because typically what happens is that the controlling shareholder would have an agenda to take advantage of minority shareholders, and very often the directors would be complicit in that. So providing more training wouldn't have much impact there. I think it's more around the capital allocation.
If you've survived a long time in the market as a fraudster, it's because you're clever, right? You haven't been caught yet. Some of the smartest people in the market know exactly what they're doing and which rules and laws they're breaking, but they make sure you don't get caught. So, training is not a solution to that end of things. But of course, I value somebody who has a degree in economics or understands free market principles and the importance of capital allocation, as Manuel does. As an investor, you look for the good guys who have some understanding not only of business but also of finance, and they're two different things. But I don't think, going back to Brian's point, that one can look at each proposal and say that's not as good as another proposal in some aspect. They're all good proposals. I do value whistleblowers as a principle. I think the Code on Governance recommends that the Audit Committees establish them.
He's agreeing with Brian.
But so that is worth doing, and so is having proper independent elected directors.
Okay, well let's just stay with directors' training for the moment. And I assume that you...
On whistleblowers, the SEC in America will pay rewards to whistleblowers to compensate them for the fact that they may become unemployable. Okay?
Well, that's good. That's a constructive comment.
And that's something that the SFC and the government here ought to be considering amending the SFO to allow, because currently it's a very lonely life, I think, if you're a whistleblower in a company. Your only real concern is, do I get charged with conspiracy or do I blow the whistle? And that's not a very good choice to make, rather than would I get protected and rewarded if I blew the whistle on this and maybe get 10% of any fines to compensate me?
Well, I think that's food for thought for our enforcement friends.
That's what the SEC
audience
does, 10%.
Anyway, now
point.
I do want to come back to David. I'm going to say something completely different. Indeed, I agree with you on this occasion. In fact, I'm going to do more. I'm going to actually congratulate you on the establishment of the Directors Training webcast, which was launched last March. For those who haven't seen it, please go into the Hong Kong Stock Exchange website and take a look. I mean, there are a lot of practical advice and a lot of tips, and given by very seasoned independent directors. Now, I want to ask you, have you had any market feedback on the webcast? And what else lies in store to try and help raise standards and improve board performance? We know that, directors training will probably never be able to remove the fraudster from our market. But I think as a general concept of continuing to raise standards, what else have you been thinking about? And I want to ask Brian, the same question as well.
Well, look, I think the websites have been very, very well received. I mean, the concept behind them is it's not standard kind of classroom training where you're sitting directors down and telling them what their fiduciary duties are and how they should behave. It's really people who are well respected in the Hong Kong community and who are either directors, chairmen, secretaries, etc., who are talking about real life experiences. So I think it's been very well received. It's a very good thing to have done. I think on the question of directors training, and I'm a little bit nervous of referring to a consultation exercise in case David tells me it wasn't what we consulted on, but I am told that, back in 2010, we put out for consultation, should we mandate directors training, and we came up with 8 hours. We didn't, David? I think, well, I'm told we did.
No, I'm saying he shouldn't have mandated it. You did consult on that, yes.
Excellent. And I think the feedback was, first of all, 8 hours was a sort of arbitrary number. Some directors need 2 hours, some directors need 30 hours. It ran the risk of just becoming...
And some will never learn.
It ran the risk of just becoming lip service. And so I think from my perspective, I think mandating a certain number of hours, we all have them in our professional kind of qualifications, I don't think it's of real value. I think... if I'm honest, it goes back to a point I've been trying to make all along. We can draft a lot of rules. We somehow need, in some of these areas, to draft a little bit of a cultural change around what happens in the boardroom, and that's very hard to do just by regulation.
Okay, well,
when you're all elected by the same shareholder, it is. Yes.
Let me ask Brian. I mean, I know that we've all said often that a box-ticking culture is not what we want to develop. How do you encourage, train people to do the right thing? I mean, is this something that the SFC think about?
Can I go back a bit to about the training point? Let's ask ourselves, what's the purpose? If the purpose is about today, talk a lot about shell activities, backdoor listing.
Corporate behavior.
Or corporate, then, so what's the purpose of training? Teaching them listing rules? Then you look at the cases. they are very familiar with listing rules.
Yeah, and how to get around them too.
Yeah.
So, and then the next sort of feeling that I'm having is, I think about when I was out as a lawyer, I took a lot of CPD. And, does it make me a better lawyer? And, I think everybody has a different opinion on that. So I think you know what I'm going to say.
Okay,
But
now,
I do think at
let's-
least one independent director should understand the listing rules. So
At least one. Wow.
we have
I thought
we
we
have
were
a
trying to raise
requirement at the moment.
standards
At
here,
least,
David.
well, at the moment it says at least one of them must have some understanding of finance. But what about the listing rules? Because currently you've got people like travel agents being appointed or insurance salespeople to fill seats on boards just because you have to have 3. And when the rule came down to 1/3, it required 1/3 independent. Those companies that had 10 directors, most of them just got rid of one, so they didn't need to appoint another independent director.
Well, I think that is a good point for me to ask an even wider question. What is our vision for our market in Hong Kong? What is the sort of market we really want to see? Highly liquid, where shares reflect their true value, number one choice, as a listing venue, and maybe no stamp duty. I don't know. I mean, are these elements on your wish list, or is there something else? I mean, could I perhaps ask each of the panel members to tell us what are the things in your wish list? Maybe Manuel, if you can go first.
Yeah,
So
I would say almost all of them. But,
ultimately,
I would like to see a market that's attractive to international and domestic investors. And I think to achieve that, we need to make sure that the stock market valuation reflects fairly the value of the underlying assets, and at the same time that there's a protection for minority shareholders and that all shareholders are treated equally. I mean, at the moment, we have a situation where, particularly in the small cap area, there's a bit of Hong Kong valuation discount. I mean, a lot of the companies I look at trade at big discounts to tangible book value. Some of them trade below the net cash. Very often, the assets in the private market would be worth 2, 3, 4 times as much as they currently are in a listing vehicle. And I think part of that reason is that foreign investors, institutional investors, when they look at particular small caps, the feedback I'm getting is that they view Hong Kong as a little bit of a corporate governance jungle, right? In the small cap space, in particular, and maybe that's because they got burnt in the
With
past.
a minefield.
Minefield.
In a jungle. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe they got burnt in the past, or they read about it, or they know someone who got burnt, but they tend to stay away. And I think another related problem is that they also focus on the on-exchange, the turnover, and that's artificially low, especially in the small cap space and the lower priced stocks. I mean, on the one hand, the execution costs are very high by international standards. I mean, you mentioned stamp duty is one aspect. The exchange fees are quite high.
Script fees.
The spreads are incredibly wide in some of the lower price stocks. I mean, you can have a 1% to 2% bid offer spread, right? So you end up in a situation where people are just sitting on the bid and the offer, and ultimately there's not much trading going on because everybody waits for the other side to cross the spread. So that leads to an artificially low trading a turnover, which is something that is important to international institutional investors. So that's another reason I think why the market might be less attractive. But I think if we implement some of the suggestions from this panel, that could go a long way to protect minority shareholders better and maybe get rid of that perception that it's a bit of a corporate governance minefield. And then at the same time, if you could increase the on-exchange turnover, that would certainly lead to some higher attraction of the market. Just one point maybe to add. What I would also like to see is a fair treatment of all shareholders or all market participants, and that would include to stop discriminating against short sellers. I think the rules for someone who owns a stock and someone who shorts a stock are widely different. There's a very negative perception around short sellers, and I think ultimately it would be very positive for Hong Kong as a market to have an even level playing field for all of the market participants.
Well, thank you very much, Manuel, for that list. Now, I do want to ask the panel one more question before we open
Can I
up
answer
our
your
floor.
question? On what would we do to improve the market?
Yes, I was going to ask. Sorry.
Because I think
I was going to
agree
see
with all of
whether
Manuel's.
you agree with.
I agree with all of Manuel's observations there, and I think you've got to look at the big picture here, which is cost of capital. Investors are very capable of discounting for risk. I've made my fortune in Hong Kong over the last 25 years investing in small caps by applying a valuation filter and a governance filter, and avoiding most of the crooks most of the time, much more than average. And that's what's got me my excess returns. But if I ever got what I wanted in terms of better corporate governance framework, better laws and regulations, some of my advantage would go away. I'm okay with that because it's for the greater good.
Advocating
But the point
against
is
yourself. But you've made it already.
But the point is, I've made mine. But the point is, this is about economic competitiveness as well. We can race to the bottom. We can have a write your own constitution, have your partnerships, have your zero voting shares, report once a year rather than 4 times, whatever you feel is right for you as a company. You can just scrap all the rules and trade on eBay if you want. But what happens then is investors discount for the risk of their companies behaving the same. And that increases the cost of capital and drives away good issuers. When people talk about Hong Kong losing this or that listing to the USA, because we wouldn't lower our standards, they're also ignoring the fact that by raising our standards, we would attract other issuers who are willing to sign up to them for that lower cost of capital and higher valuation. And we should be racing to the top by raising our framework and doing it before those capital controls that we kept talking about earlier today, before those are really abolished and there's more competition for what we do.
Thank you, David. I just want to ask both Brian and David Graham whether they have anything to add to the list, to the wish list that our 2 other panelists have put out.
Yes, I do.
That's a long list.
I think when Carlson today singled the point about our joint action with ICAC, certainly that attracted a lot of our attention. So actually the full range of sanctions in Hong Kong typically, so listing rules having non-statutory sort of consequences, SFO, some statutory consequences, but not as serious as criminal sanctions. So its full spectrum of deterrent actually worked quite well for many years in Hong Kong. So as Ashley said, the game changer is Stock Connect. Actually, before that, instead of having predominantly just state-owned enterprises, we started to have loads of private enterprises from China. So that poses a huge challenge for us that there is a huge portion of companies, the directors, and even now shareholders, that Hong Kong will face lots of difficulties in sort of imposing criminal consequences on them, on their behavior. That by itself, in my view, is something close to unsolvable. It's a huge challenge as to the 2 legal systems differences. So I would think that is a very, very difficult issue that I don't have an answer. But if we don't have an answer, honestly, I think we're going to see lots of sort of behavior like that.
Well, you're talking about the cross-border enforcement problem and the fact that we can't extradite people to here and they can't extradite.
It's not merely about enforcement cooperation because actually Hong Kong works very well. Right. We work very well with them.
But we can't charge mainlanders unless we can bring them to court in Hong Kong with criminal offences. But you wouldn't want reporters extradited to China for leaking state secrets, and so there probably isn't going to be an extradition treaty between the 2 unless it's one way. But I do think that there is a scope for increased civil deterrent, which is absent at the moment except for the SFC. All of the enforcement work is done by the SFC, including stepping into the shoes of shareholders and bringing effectively litigation against directors and companies, ordering them to disgorge this or that money or sue this or that director. When if we had a proper class action system, which the Law Reform Commission under Anthony Neo proposed more than 5 years ago, and the government's still sitting on that proposal. If we had a class action system and if we had litigation financing by abolishing the medieval Champati and maintenance laws, then we'd allow investors, shareholders, if there was a defendant worth going after in Hong Kong, assets worth going after, or even enforcement across the border, to bring their own civil actions, and so that would provide an extra layer of deterrent to bad behaviour that currently it's all on the shoulders of the SFC to bring those actions. I think that's rather unfair. I'm sure that lawyers and litigation funders could make their own judgments about those things.
So, in fact, the two of you are basically saying that deterrence, effective deterrence, is a very important element to have in order to create the market that we want to see. Is that the point? Okay.
People actually call it incentives and deterrence.
Right.
And
okay. Well, that is a good segue for me to go into the final question before I open it to the floor, which is. We've also heard that deterrence can be a very effective tool to change abusive corporate behavior, and clearly we have an array of commonly used tools: public censures, fines, and disqualification orders, civil actions, and directors' training. But are they adequate? Are they effective? And do we need faster delisting policies, and or we just want to have a disclosure-based regime so that basically, and stronger enforcement action, 10 of Tom Atkinson, or do we want something else? So maybe as a final round of questions, could I ask each of you to say, if you have to prioritize and identify your top choice of tools to be used to deter, bad corporate behavior, what would that be?
Well, my first choice would be all the things I've mentioned already. The second one,
out of all of no, that's not answering the question.
There's an unsettled issue in Hong Kong. 15 years ago this month, a government-appointed expert group recommended shifting the regulatory responsibility out of the stock exchange, which has a for-profit conflict of interests, and moving that to the SFC, unifying it with the administration of the Takeovers Code, which the SFC already does, and giving the whole lot statutory backing, so you could actually be fined for breaking the listing rules. So far, almost none of that has happened, except for the rule on disclosure of price-sensitive information, which is now market misconduct. The government actually stepped back the other way after a consultation last year, which proposed a listing policy committee that would actually be rulemaking, and left that authority with the listing committee. And the history after that, which is to pursue the second-class share system for Hong Kong. Now, so we need actually to bite that bullet and adopt the same structure that the other two leading international markets, London and New York, have, which is to have a statutory regulator for listings, and let the exchange get on with being an exchange, and then introduce competition so that it becomes a better, cheaper exchange with lower profit margins, because frankly it's a very lucrative monopoly right now. Okay, so your top two is to totally revamp our regulatory structure to put the listing division under effectively the SFC, right? And do all the other things I mentioned. Okay, do all the things I mentioned. Thank you very much. Now go to the other David.
Not surprisingly, I don't think I agree with that.
No.
You could work for the SFC.
I could work.
You can come up with your tool. What would be your tool?
I don't think, first of all, I don't think we can move to a disclosure-based regime. I think that would be a mistake. I think we have to have a combination of rules and regulations at the front, but we can't build the barrier too high. I think, to Brian's point, I think enforcement is very, very important at the end of the day. So if we had if we had a more effective, quicker way of dealing with some of the enforcement issues we see, I think that would be very good for our market. Because I do think that sends... Is delisting... Well, delisting, the trouble with delisting is, we are putting forward a faster delisting policy, as you know. That was one of the consultation exercises. So that is something that we can do, we recognize. The difficulty with it is it hurts, in one sense, the people we are trying to protect. The shareholders. It hurts the shareholders. So it's not a very effective tool from that perspective. It has a benefit from a market quality perspective, but as a sanction, I'm not sure it sends the right message. Whereas I think some of the things that Tom and his team have done and some of the investigations they're making, they will have an effect of changing corporate culture and corporate behavior in a way that just changing the rules at the front won't have. Because as we all know from all the things that Brian put on the slides, There are clever lawyers, investment bankers in this market, and they found ways around the rules. That's the problem.
Yeah,
so
I mean, delisting companies that are in suspension is not a market quality issue. It doesn't improve the market quality because they've already got to that situation. It's like walking around an intensive care ward and shooting the patients, frankly. If there is a hope of the company recapitalizing and restoring some value to its shareholders, they have that right. A listing is not just for Christmas. There is only one stock exchange. There's nowhere else to go and trade the shares afterwards, and they lose what little protection they have from the listing rules in terms of financial reporting, for example, and connected transaction rules. So I don't favour rapid delistings or Chinese style. If you lose money for 2 years in a row, then you get delisted. Mainland style.
Okay, well, let's try and hear what Manuel has to say about his choice of effective two to deter abusive corporate conduct. What would be your choice be, top choice? I know it's difficult to choose, and you can say all of the above and this.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what's really at the top of my mind is fraud risk and inefficient capital allocation. So if I had to pick two specific things that I would like to see changed, so taking it one level down rather than kind of the high-level things that were discussed now, from the fraud, to address the fraud risk and to mitigate that and enhance minority shareholder protection, my pick would be the independent directors. I would make sure that the controlling shareholders can't vote on them. And then from I guess, capital allocation perspective, reduce the general mandate and tighten some of the rules around highly dilutive rights issues and entitlement offers. And then why don't we have a consultation around the cash-out test that David proposed, which I'm in favor of, and I think it would be good to see what other market participants think about that.
Okay, thank you. Brian, you have the last word on this question.
Yes,
Your
I'm not...
top choice of effective tool to change behavior.
I'm not going to reopen the debate about listing reform and whether David and I should be the frontline listing regulator. I'm not going to do that. But I want to emphasize that the front-loaded approach, in my view, is pretty effective. Instead of traditionally, we have to wait for 1, 2, or 3 years for an enforcement outcome to send a deterrent effect. What we are doing now is typically my colleagues will conduct a Section 179, and sometimes, very often, under one SFC principle, Tom's team, my team will work together to invoke a lot of our investigatory powers. These powers are ours, and David doesn't have that power. So we can sort of combine all these powers in sort of using a pretty interventionist approach in terms of transactions, IPOs, and even sometimes a lot of corporate governance issues. And I have to say I find that pretty effective, and actually there are observations that it seems that change a bit of conduct of the market. So whilst there are very challenging issues ahead of us, that is at the moment, I would say that is a pretty positive that we'll continue to do that.
Okay, well, thank you. Now, I have received a couple of questions, and the first one, I just want a yes and no answer. It's actually very consistent with what we've discussed. And the question is, has the time come to license directors? Yes and no. I think maybe licensed directors. It doesn't distinguish independent, non-executive, or executive, but I assume it's
well, as a matter of company law, you can't stop people electing whoever they want to be a director.
But I think it's almost as if, imposing a qualification requirement.
You have a disqualification provision in law.
Yes,
you
indeed.
Can be banned.
But I think what we are suggesting, I mean, by the sounds of this question, is that only certain licensed directors could be picked to be independent directors. I mean, is it practical?
Well, as I said earlier, you might want to require at least one of them to have a certificate in listing rules,
well,
for example.
we certainly have that particular qualification, financial...
Well, we have a vague financial requirement, but, maybe at least one, maybe two, should understand the listing rules. You might have one who's there for his industry knowledge, because he's in the same industry, or was once. But, it wouldn't be such a stretch if we coupled that with a proper election system to say, one of those people must be
maybe
knowledgeable, because they need to blow the whistle.
I mean,
right
could
time.
we take it that as part of the IPO approval process, there is already a kind of a review process on the qualification, experience, and skills of directors?
That doesn't stop the directors being replaced.
But it's not a continuous basis.
Right. So that doesn't stop the directors being replaced the next day or dying.
Right.
And shareholder activism taken to extremes.
Right, okay. So you're in favour of licensing directors?
Only to a point, as I said, not all of them.
Only
I wouldn't,
to a point.
wouldn't restrict.
Okay, well, let's ask Manuel. Licensing directors.
I don't think that's necessarily the solution. I would support more directors training around capital allocation, but a licensing system I don't think is the right
Okay,
answer.
thank you. David?
You just want a yes or no answer, did you?
If you wish. No.
No.
All right. Okay. Now, if I may have one more. This is a very interesting question. Obviously, there's been a lot of media about scam stocks and corporate fraud. As investors, how would you detect and avoid investing in these companies? So probably pointed to our two investors here. Is there a set of red flags which you will look out for? I mean, they're really getting the money's worth.
I thought the Moody's red flags were very good. The SFC disagreed with that, but yes. If you look at your top
list of red flags.
I will have to mention website.com at this point, because if you go to the site.
No free
it's
advertising.
20 years old, it's non-profit, not okay.
But I did,
and zero revenue, so I would probably qualify for listing.
There would be a question over that.
So
there is a suitability qualifier.
There's a who's who database of every listed company director since 1990 on there, so we've got 29 years nearly of data. And you can certainly see sort of independent directors of last resort, the ones who are associated with negative returns across a whole portfolio of directorships, from the date of appointment until the date they left, or if they're still there. Similarly, you can find the auditors of last resort and know which companies to avoid if they've gone out and appointed that auditor, their prospects not too good. And so there are some basic tests you can do without all the homework I do on looking at past behaviour, but you do have to, unfortunately, spend an enormous amount of time reading past disclosures by companies and really assessing where their incentives and deterrents lie, which I can't summarise at all, even in 100 hours, let alone 2 minutes.
Thank you.
In assessing, are you really likely to get your fair share of the returns, and has the market factored that into its valuation? Because often it hasn't.
Okay, thank you. Manuel,
My view? Well, I think it's much more important to focus on how the management team has behaved in the past rather than what they say. So I focus on, besides checking website, of course, on the directors and their history, is to look at what happened to the profits that the business generated. Where's the cash being reinvested? Is it just accumulating on the balance sheet? How effectively is the balance sheet being managed? That already goes a very long way in determining, whether there's a potential fraud risk or not, and whether you will, as a minority shareholder, share in the growth and the profits of the company.
Okay, thank you. I think that time is up, so I think what remains is for me to thank our panel members very much for their time and the contribution
Thank you,
at this
Teresa.
forum. Thank you. Thank you very much.